Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to people joining the webinar. I see we're just letting a few more people in. Please just bear with us a little bit, few more seconds. Can everyone hear me okay? Kate, can you just put your thumbs up if you can hear me good? Great, thank you very much. Excellent. Okay, well, I think we'll start, and we've got a good group in, so let's kick off. First off, can you see my slide on the screen? Okay, that's good for you. Excellent, great, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of you joining this webinar. This is a webinar on how to close the nature financing gap through water, and it's presented as part of a series of webinars that have been brought to the public from an initiative called WINS, Water in Net Zero, that is hosted by AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. My name is James Dalton. I'm the Global Director of Water and Wetlands at IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and I'm based in our headquarter office in Switzerland, which is where I'm talking to you from today. Now, you will see on your screen some simple housekeeping rules for the course of this webinar. We only have 60 minutes, so we will be fairly rapid through this process. Participants, if you can keep your cameras and microphones off, just so we minimize disturbance unless you're actually speaking. We will be recording this webinar, and it's recording now. So if you do not want to be on the webinar recorded, please leave now, and then we'll make sure the link is accessible so you can watch it afterwards. Feel free to share your comments and questions with us through the chat Q&A function that is available on the Teams channel. And we will moderate those through the course of the hour and make sure that we use those to help throw questions towards the panel. And we also encourage a respectful and positive atmosphere. So please do moderate your language and any interaction and instructions with ourselves, the panelists, and other people listening to the webinar. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to just run you through the agenda. We're going to have a very short introduction from Josh Weinberg. Josh is going to talk to us a little bit about what WINS and what Water in Net Zero is. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the three outcomes of the recent three COPs, UNCCD, UNFCCC, and CBD for biodiversity that happened at the end of last year, just to give it a bit of an update on some of the thinking, some of the findings, some of the feedback from those processes when it comes to the role of water, in particular when it comes to climate and mitigation. We're then going to have a panel discussion. We've got a great set of people who we're going to talk, raise some questions with, and talk some things through. And you're welcome to throw your questions in directly to them as individuals or to the panel more broadly. And then we will wrap up at the top of the hour. And then we're hoping to keep this alive through the WINS LinkedIn platform. We'll continue this through with questions and further responses. So if you have further questions that don't get raised in this hour, that you want to keep on the table, that you would like the panel to respond to, or you'd like a response to, even from other people watching, then please do we will keep those questions and we will put them onto the WINS LinkedIn channel. Just to keep the conversation going and keep us moving. So you've heard enough from me already. Let me move on now to the speakers. So we're first going to hear from Josh Weinberg. He's a senior policy advisor at AGWA and the coordinator of WINS. And then we have our panel to come, including Noreen Anisha, who's from Oregon State University. Then we'll hear a little bit from Lucy Watkinson, who's from the Climate, Biodiversity and Water and Environment Directorate in OECD in Paris. And then we have a couple of extra people to really bring the conversation alive in the panel. Kate Lamb, who's a strategic advisor with the Ambition Loop and freshwater strategy specialist with UNEP FI. Then Tom Panella, senior advisor for water, natural capital and climate. Bapon Fakruddin, who's the water resource management senior specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And then also Iara Giacomini, who's the Director of River Basin Rehabilitation and Access to Water and Multiple Uses of Water Resources from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil. So it's great to have you all with us. So let's move over to you, Josh, just to give us a bit of a run through over what WINS is and give everyone a bit of an understanding of that. So over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, James. And I really appreciate being with all of you today, your interest in this webinar, and your interest in the Water Initiative for Net Zero events. I'll be very brief. WINS, the Water Initiative for Net Zero, is a global network, as James mentioned, hosted by the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And we promote water as a key part of the solutions to reach net zero emissions and climate resilient development. At least 10% of emissions can be reduced directly by actions through water management across sectors. And WINS works to mobilize knowledge, dialogue, and action with partners across our network in each of those sectors to both promote those solutions and knowledge and also try to integrate those into policy and finance. This includes working across agriculture. Emissions from rice is one large area that needs to be addressed, across the water sector through utilities and technology solutions and water and sanitation and development, as well as looking more broadly into how we integrate water resilience into the clean energy transition. And today's our second webinar looking at one of the biggest opportunities and more complex areas, which is looking across nature-based solutions and freshwater systems for the opportunities to reduce emissions and develop other co-benefits. And as James mentioned, we hope this is, as the other events with WINS, is one part of the process, and it's a continued dialogue and discussion and engagement that you can continue with us throughout the year. So we'll be sharing the links for how you can engage with us moving forward. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the speakers today. Thanks, James.
Great, thanks ever so much, Josh. That's a really good overview of what WINS is. So I'm just going to talk very briefly then about the key outcomes that really came from the previous 3 Rio COPs that we heard about at the end of last year. Are the Rio Conventions, UNCCD, CBD, and UNFCCC, are they themselves fit for purpose when it comes to water? Are they staffed and resourced appropriately across the 3 secretariats? And are they fit for mobilizing resources for the conventions on the role of water? And in this case, for this conversation, can this bring clear water benefits, but also the co-benefits for for climate, in particular mitigation benefits, as well as adaptation and biodiversity benefits? In that sense, are we missing an opportunity here by mobilizing resources for water, but not thinking about where those resources could go to improve mitigation benefits from water perspectives and the co-benefits that brings? And therefore, are we missing the trick of seeing investments in water as an opportunity to reduce emissions, in particular at the country level? We know, for example, that there are not many countries highlighting peatlands within their NDCs, only about 5%. We know that there are missed opportunities when it comes to the role that wetlands play and peatlands in storing carbon, but also within the planning other countries are doing to improve their climate situation to reduce emissions and through their NDCs, but also within their MBSAPs, their biodiversity plans. Are we seeing enough attention being paid to freshwater ecosystems because of their biodiversity benefits and their knock-on carbon benefits? Water has traditionally been treated and still is very much a critical resource on this planet, perhaps, I would argue, the most important resource. But at the same time, we're not necessarily highlighting enough in these conventions, and in particular in the rollout of operationalizing plans to mobilize the conventions at the ground level, so through countries themselves. But this is changing. And the 3 COPs at the end of last year showed some very good direction on this. Within UNFCCC, the awareness of water is consistently and constantly increasing every year on year, both within the formal processes, but also within the formal events and the informal events and things happening around the discussions. What's amazing is that you can walk around many of the events that are going on around any of those pavilions and side events at the UNFCCC COPs, and water is starting to be more recognised within those discussions. At UNCCD, we've seen water there at the end of last year more than it ever has been before. Its absence within UNCCD on desertification and drought has become a major opportunity to put water more centrally into that convention and the activities at the country level delivering against what the convention needs to focus on. CBD on biodiversity is perhaps the greatest challenge. The negotiations didn't work out at the end of last year. They'll reconvene in Rome shortly. In terms of what happened was a limitation on mobilizing financing for protecting biodiversity. But actually, I think possibly the opportunity there is that despite the suspension of those negotiations over resources, there is growing recognition of the role of freshwater ecosystems, these powerhouses for carbon storage of wetlands and peatlands, and the recent work from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water on how land affects hydrology, something we've known about for a long time, but something that our water management strategies have not perhaps dealt with adequately. And this is an important shift in awareness, in advocacy, and in mobilizing a larger network of resources and institutions and capacity to put water more centrally into climate strategies. So I will stop talking there, and I think it's best that I hand over now to Noreen Anisha. Is Noreen with us? And then hopefully Noreen can talk to us a little bit about the work that she's been doing before we move over to Lucy. Noreen, I will stop sharing my screen.
No worries. So, yeah.
So Noreen, hang on. One of the things I was going to ask you is, you've been involved in this report, The Essential Drop to Reach Net Zero, unpacking freshwater's role in climate change mitigation. So give us an understanding of what the role of freshwater brings to climate mitigation. What's sort of the headline topics within that report on that?
Thank you, James. So we particularly talk about freshwater ecosystems and its potential for climate change mitigation. And the reason we emphasize on freshwater ecosystems, which we mean inland wetlands, peatlands, floodplains, rivers, lakes, it's because compared to coastal and marine wetlands, which we call the blue carbon ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems are significantly underexplored and underrepresented for emission reduction and carbon accumulation. Well, wetlands occupy like 6% of global land and store for over 33% of global soil carbon, organic soil carbon. Now, wetlands can be, say, seen in three states or conditions. One is like undisturbed natural wetland, which are preserved. Then there are degraded, drained, disturbed wetlands, which is very common in the world right now. And then there are restored, re-wetted condition of wetlands. And while in their undisturbed conditions, they are like a huge storage of organic soil carbon. In degraded conditions, they become a net source of significant emissions. So latest research suggests that in our current trajectory of wetland degradation globally could result in greenhouse gas emission equivalent of around 408 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from like 2021 till the end of this century, which is a huge amount of emissions. And re-wetting wetlands that are degraded in a global scale can reduce emissions by around 250 plus minus 150 gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent by the end of this century. And it's very important to understand this dynamics in the wetlands, which is not very largely present around the world, which is like, this dynamics is not very simple, but it's also not very difficult to understand, which is like re-wetting wetlands can sometimes emit methane and nitrous oxide, but it is fully compensated by the carbon dioxide uptake or absorption that is done by re-wetting or restoring this wetlands. Again, if we look at peatlands, a very dense store of organic carbon, globally there's around like 500 gigaton of carbon accumulation in peatlands. And, just by protecting our existing peatlands, by reducing, the drainage and burning of these peatlands, we can reduce emissions like 0.5 to 1.2 gigaton, carbon dioxide equivalent of emissions per year. And in fact, like same is seen for floodplains. And of course, when they are in undisturbed condition, they are huge storage of carbon. But even when they're restored, they have significantly high carbon accumulation compared to the degraded state. And latest research suggests that, particularly for floodplain wetlands, that even this carbon storage that we have accounted, or scientists have accounted historically, is small, only for the topsoil layers. At the deeper layers, flood plains accumulate even much more soil carbon. So for mitigation benefits, looks like we need to protect our wetlands as much as we can in undisturbed conditions, and then restore and re-wet the degraded ones, and that can have very high mitigation benefits. And when we did our meta-analysis for our chapter, we understood that mitigation potential of freshwater wetlands vary context to context. We outlined some significant knowledge gaps regarding how to utilize these wetlands, lakes, rivers, floodplains for carbon sequestration based on the region, the surrounding land management, and their climatic and geological conditions. Even when we analyzed the updated nationally determined contribution of different countries, we found that freshwater systems are mostly considered for adaptation, whereas blue carbon ecosystems, particularly mangroves, are included for mitigation by multiple countries. And very, very few countries included restoration or protection of freshwater systems as mitigation measures in their respective NDCs. Another thing that we highlighted was that when we talk about emission reduction through freshwater ecosystems, integrated land management repeatedly comes up. It is because when it comes to restoration, particularly restoring like the hydrology conditions, be it the seasonal flood poles, water depth, water retention time, sediments, nutrients carried by the water, hydrology connectivity, all of these are connected to the surrounding landscapes. The solution lies.
So Noreen, so let me stop you there, because I think you've given us some great work, great thinking to go on. So basically, leave them undisturbed, these systems, right? So don't degrade, restore where you can, re-wet where you can, and work with an actual system maintaining connectivity. So that these are key top sort of headline items. That's great. I really want to thank you for that, because we're going to come back to some of these points over the course of the panel. So can I now ask Lucy if she doesn't mind joining us as well? Lucy Watkinson from OECD. Thanks very much, Noreen. Lucy, do you want to join us? Noreen, if you can stop sharing, thanks. And then Lucy should come up. And Lucy, why don't you just let us know who you are? And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about and hear from you was about this latest report from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, valuing the hydrological cycle as a global common good. So give us a little bit of an understanding from your perspective of the role of water within a climate mitigation within that.
Thanks very much, James. And thanks for having me today. Great to be here with you all. As James said, I'm Lucy Watkinson. I'm a special advisor to the head of climate, biodiversity and water in the Environment Directorate at the OECD, but worked most recently with the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which was facilitated by a dedicated team at the OECD. So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of some of the main findings from the Commission, but there is a lot more to be seen in the Commission's report, which you can find online, of course. So the Global Commission presents a lot of evidence, basically, for why we must redefine this relationship between water and climate. And it really makes the case for why a stable hydrological cycle should be considered a global common good. As we know, but the Commission really brings forward, the hydrological cycle is both impacted by and a compounding factor of climate change, and should therefore, as we've heard already, play a much more prominent role in the strategies to mitigate both climate change and biodiversity loss. It's a victim of climate change, but also a driver. It's now this really vicious cycle. And the feedback between land cover and rainfall generation is a critical yet underappreciated component of this global hydrological cycle and of climate mitigation. Forests and natural lands are the source of 45% of rainfall on land. So disruptions to these ecosystems, such as through the destruction of wetlands that we've just heard from Noreen, deforestation and degradation of land, for example, through agricultural practices, it's accentuating climate change and preventing that carbon sequestration. But further to that, the Commission explains that we are interconnected through water. And that's not just the blue water that we see that runs across boundaries, but through the atmospheric flows of moisture, which carry water from one country to another. And that's across oceans and across continents. So that's a really important point that the Commission makes strongly, that degrading freshwater resources in one location therefore affects rainfall in both that area, so in your own area where you're degrading those ecosystems, but also in lands that are much further away. And the evidence shows that all countries and regions are interconnected, and they depend on one or several neighbouring areas to secure a stable supply of fresh water. So the findings of the Commission point towards a future of water risks. And we found that actually that's most often in regions where people and economies have the greatest need. A growing water scarcity, as well as extreme variation in rainfall, is threatening both livelihoods and economies. The Commission found that nearly 3 billion people and more than half of the world's food production are now in areas where water, which is stored either on or below the Earth's surface, is projected to decline. So that's 55% of the world's food production. And there are specific concerns in irrigated areas, which are, of course, critical to food security, and they're responsible for roughly 40% of agricultural value. And just briefly, I know, James, I don't have very long, so I'm going to go quickly, just a few more key findings on the economic side. So as we all know, water is a ubiquitous input used either explicitly or implicitly in all economic activity. And the Commission estimated that by 2050, on average, in high-income countries, we could see an 8% drop in global GDP. And in lower and lower middle-income countries, that impact would actually be much more pronounced, which could face a drop of between 10 and 15% of GDP. And importantly, these losses are larger than those projected by climate economic models, which often neglect the real role of water. I will leave it there, James, because I'm conscious of the time, but I'm happy to answer any questions and expand on anything further.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lucy. That's wonderful. So if you can leave your camera on, can I ask Kate, Bapon, Tom, Iara, and Noreen to put your cameras back on as we convene our panel? Great, thank you. Excellent. So yeah, if you've got questions, please let us have them in the Q&A or in the chat whilst we kick off the discussion. So Kate, let's come to you first. So just reflecting on some of these issues, how do we better use water as a way to reduce emissions? But when I say water, I don't mean, the direct sort of the substance that's coming out of your tap. I mean the freshwater ecosystems and the things that Noreen talked a little bit about, and that link to broader hydrology. And in so doing, using those systems and investing in them as climate solutions also, of course, brings much needed resources for biodiversity in those spaces as well, which biodiversity always struggles to get the money in the right place to do these sort of activities to protect these systems. And what's your sort of thoughts on this? What's your solutions to this, or any good examples that you've got where you think actually there are things out there that can work in this space, but we need to do more of them?
Thanks, James. This is a question that we've obviously all been noodling over for a very long time. Often, there's a perception that investment in water is by naturally default green and is going to be good for the environment or good for climate. And as we know, in many circumstances, that is not necessarily the case. It's why the thing I want to draw your attention to, our audience's attention to today, is a product that you, myself, John Matthews, and a whole range of other international experts leaned in on in about, I think it was 2018, 2019, pre-COVID, feels like an entire lifetime ago. And that is something called the Climate Bonds Initiative Water Infrastructure Criteria. So we had woken up to the fact that, again, most of the investments, most of the climate-related investments going into, or most of the dollars flowing into water-related infrastructure, first of all, it was all going into grey infrastructure and was not fit for purpose from a mitigation or a resilience perspective. Thank you, John. 2016, holy moly, it's made me feel much older than I already do. Of course, I'm still only 25, so I was ahead of the curve at that stage. So for those of you that don't know, and I'll put a link in the chat in a moment, we got together with the CBI, with the team from Ceres as well, to create a standard that will ensure that any investment in water-related projects that wanted to say that it had a climate angle, that it was either strong on mitigation or strong on resilience, and wanted to get a certificate for it, or wanted to issue a bond to make a public statement that it was meeting these needs, we got together and designed a standard to enable that to happen. So the standard is called, again, I'll repeat it again, it's the Climate Bond Standard for Water Infrastructure Criteria, and it delivers, when used, measurable benefits across climate, biodiversity, and land systems, as well, of course, as water. And it achieves it through three mechanisms. The first is mobilization of capital. We know, we've talked about it ad nauseum forever and ever, amen, that the critical bottleneck in achieving SDG 6 is financing. So by using the standard to define what constitutes credible green water infrastructure projects, both grey and natural infrastructure, the standard channels capital towards those projects that not only address water security issues, but also contribute to broader climate and ecosystem objectives. So, for example, the criteria emphasize investments in nature-based solutions such as wetland restoration, floodplain management, whilst at the same time delivering ecosystem services, enhancing biodiversity, enhancing climate resilience, and improving land resilience. And crucially, the use of the standard, and if those of you on the call may not be familiar with the world of climate bonds, but the Climate Bonds Initiative has existed for a very long time. It's an incredibly legitimate organization. The climate bond space is now worth over $1 trillion every year. So by providing this level of legitimacy and credibility to a water bond that is then put on the market, investors get the clarity that they need. The projects are much less risky, and therefore, as a result, they attract private sector involvement and incentivize more large-scale financing to meet these urgent issues. The second mechanism, and I mentioned there's three, so this is the second one, is that it by default integrates climate resilience and biodiversity goals into the project design phase of any water-related project. So it ensures that it's not only, again, meeting the immediate needs of getting water where we need it straight away, and even maybe delivering very strong, fast mitigation work. It also delivers outcomes from long-term sort of systemic challenges posed by climate change, because it embeds climate resilience as a core principle and promotes infrastructure, therefore, that's capable of withstanding any variability to climate change. The final third mechanism, I know I'm conscious of time, we don't have a huge amount of it. So the third mechanism that the standard uses, which is one that's obviously very close to my heart, given where I spent the last 13 years, but it is on enhanced accountability, transparency, and measurable impact, which is the thing, again, that we all need more of in order to get more confident and more money flowing. So the criteria set rigorous requirements for monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and third-party verification, ensuring that these water-related projects deliver measurable outcomes and are aligned with sustainability goals, whether they're national or international. So, for instance, there are metrics related to carbon sequestration, biodiversity health, and water use efficiency, which provide then a level of transparency that again enables sort of continuous improvement of these projects. And they're all essential, of course, for aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement, the coming Montreal Agreement, as well as the SDGs. So I think by fostering accountability, the standard ultimately builds confidence among stakeholders. And it's up to us as a water community to start to learn more about what this framework is and advocate for its use. I think we've possibly not leveraged it at all for our needs. But we also need to be aware that the implementers, issuers of such bond, do need to have fairly sophisticated teams in place in order to execute on it. And that's one thing that I think, again, we as a community can lean in and provide that level of expertise, particularly in SIDS and other developing economies. Thanks, James.
Great. No, that's great. Thanks very much, Kate. I mean, the idea of using a credible framework that channels capital into the right place to get the solutions we want, it all sounds so simple, right? But we know it's complicated. And John's point about going back to 2016 demonstrates that, yeah, we probably haven't really leveraged that, as you said. We haven't mobilized it anywhere near as far as we probably could. But staying on that topic of standards and regulations and accessing that type of finance, let's move to you now, Bapon. And I think you're going to talk to us a little bit about some of the elements that the GCF gets involved with around this type of work on mobilizing capital through using regulations, compliance, standards, that type of approach.
Yeah, thanks a lot, James. So, I mean, before going to our role and how actually we package some of those things, I think, as you just rightly pointed, that the three conventions that we have, and if you observe them quite closely, you can see that how crucial actually, and it creates an opportunity to linkage the interconnectedness as we are talking about the climate, biodiversity, and land systems. But however, if you look at it on an operational level, we are actually quite silos on these three pillars at the national scale, because it's actually managed by three different entities. While actually the flood and drought is like two faces of a one coin, but actually it's completely managed into differently. So how can actually we bring them together? That's maybe the operationally biggest challenges for us actually, to making sure that the interconnectedness of this nature of challenges, how actually create an interconnected solution that could be actually bring it to the operational domain, and how that could be actually channeled from the operational domain to the community or the most vulnerable. And I think that's where actually GCF comes to design some of those very innovative water projects, where we try to look at a one way how we can actually create a policy ecosystem as well as regulatory function that could enable to interconnectedness one way, but also the Kate point of view that we also, as we know that actually the amount of demand we need, amount of resource actually we require to make the solution, nobody has such kind of financing. So that means we actually think about actually beyond actually our traditional grant and loan kind of mechanism. It need to have a more innovative financing mechanism, as well as it need to be crowdsourcing the other financing. So that means bringing the private sector in. But then what are the de-risking environment we actually created into the market that could create an opportunity for private sector to come and play a critical role? And I think that's why GCF actually trying to create a space that using our innovative financial instrument, because we are the quite unique institution who can actually blend our financing, create a concessionality depending on the countries or the entity's requirement. And that brings an biggest opportunity to create a market opportunity into this particular space. And then we are a scalable organization where actually we try to look at actually what are the new innovation, what are the new product could we bring in to create a paradigm shift for climate action. And if it is actually a piloted, how can actually be scaling up through a large mechanism? And on that sense, you saw that our average ticket size of the project is actually $50 to $70 million. But for some of the water project, we actually go in a single country project up to $1.5 billion. Actually, you saw that in South Africa last year. And in the last COP, we also announced a $3.5 billion project for the Central Asia, that how the glacier is melting, but how utilize those melted water for the country to, changing the livelihood, bringing the food security, bringing the community resilience. So those kind of things require that kind of scaling up. But also at the last leg, it requires a knowledge, because you alone cannot do everything. So how actually you create a knowledge bank so that actually that could lead to develop to the least developed, to the most vulnerable community, to learn and package those kind of an idea into practice. And here is the most complexity, is that water is actually quite granularity, because what we are talking about the climate change is on the high scale. But when you're talking about the water impact, it's actually very localized. And understanding the climate impact into water require a subsidiary data-driven, evidence-based information. And most often, actually, those are not available in the country, because you'll not find actually quite good modeler who can actually analyze those data set to understand what is the climate impact into their watershed. So how actually you can create those kind of ecosystems? How can we create those kind of knowledge? How can we create those kind of capacity building is quite important. How can actually we go beyond our traditional hydrological system? If we look at even our 50 years back hydrological system, where we only think about that water cycle, gauge to gauge relationships, not actually trying to looking at more interdisciplinary approach. But I think this is the time now actually to bring actually how, based on the emerging situation, how we can actually work together more multidisciplinary to come up with a various solution for action. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Bapon. So very relevant topic around the whole synergies between both global frameworks, but also at the national level. Getting synergies right at the international level has to build upon national level support and capacity first. If you can't manage your own water, it's very difficult then to manage across sectors and manage across borders. So I think really key points there. So let's keep those in mind when we move to Tom. Tom, why don't you just briefly introduce yourself and then let us know a little bit about your experiences, I think, with the ADB and the work that you were doing there on biodiversity and wetlands and their potential for mitigation.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks to all my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. So, yeah, I'm Tom Panella. I'm in Bangkok, and I am currently working with Agua, with source to sea management and a role in Seaweed. But previously I'd worked for Asian Development Bank, leading the water practice, and then director for climate and natural capital. So I want to talk about an initiative at ADB that was the Regional Flyway Initiative for the Australasia Flyway, which is a biodiversity-led initiative with the goal of a $3 billion investment for wetlands, basically. And so how we look at the mitigation aspect here is a co-benefit from working with governments in preparing projects to conserve, enhance wetlands and water management, to improve wetlands for migratory waterfowl. But at the same time, obviously, as a development bank, you're looking at livelihood. So you're looking at habitat restoration, sustainable agriculture, sustainable aquaculture, pollution prevention, and nature protection and ecotourism as a part of this. So this started off as a technical assistance with 8 countries looking to improve 50 wetlands. And where we've had the most traction, or where ADB has had the most traction with this, is in the PRC, where you have a very sophisticated client that values these resources and is looking at using public and private sector funds to come in. So how does this then come down to the ground scale? So let me talk about one project that was recently approved that I was involved in managing its preparation, which is the Hunan South Donting Lake Wetland Restoration and Sustainable Development Project. This was about 300 million, of which AFD and ADB financed about 2/3 of it. But in looking at it, so you did have a significant mitigation outcome, about 10% of the finance. But you had significantly more, over a third of it, half being adaptation. But how do you take these funds and really make them work? Well, the first thing is developing planning and supporting the local institutions to improve their planning and MRV capacity. And I think the MRV component is quite important, as mentioned by Kate. And then investing in that, you also invest in looking at how you can restore wetlands, improve water management. And I think that's the important thing, is you want to improve the management of water resources to ensure that the wetlands and those critical habitat for adaptation and mitigation are enhanced. And so providing money for that, in addition to the moving earth, or just getting action on the ground. It's really the institutions that matter to do this. And then also some of the financial institutions that need to be scaled up. And that's taking some of the concessional money that could flow through an IFI loan that may have GCF support, but like working with the PRC, that they have a quite advanced eco-compensation framework, both at national, provincial, and local level, where farmers and other users of the resource are rewarded or penalized for using that resource in a more sustainable and climate oriented way. And that's been a big part of many of the projects that we've done, that ADB has done. And then you also, another way to take that kind of global money and get it into the pockets of local people, but also involve the financial sector and the private sector, is through financial intermediary lending, where the government will put concessional funds into commercial banks, and those commercial banks are then responsible for all the safeguard and other policies that a multilateral development bank would normally require, plus the ability to access those funds for smallholders. Medium-sized enterprises need to be climate friendly and climate driven, and that needs to be a part of the application process for accessing these funds. And so again, you're letting the market work at the local level to move towards both biodiversity, and in the way biodiversity, you're conserving, improving wetlands for adaptation, and then getting mitigation benefits. So the South Dunting Lake project was just approved. There's another project for about 600 million that will be approved next year. This is again in the PRC, the Fuzhou Municipal and Yangshu County governments, Fujian Coastal Cities and Biodiversity Project. And there's about 5 or 6 ongoing technical assistance to use this framework of wetlands, conservation of the flyway as a way to enhance water management decisions, climate change adaptation, and at the same time, mitigation. So it's really kind of coming through a co-benefit, but it's biodiversity and water management front and center that's leading the way on this initiative. I'll stop there, James.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. No, that's great. It makes it real for people. I think right at the beginning you mentioned it improves, integrates activities around tourism, and just makes things realistic. That solving climate is about growing your economy. It's about shifting what you do in a way that mobilizes these types of solutions. It's not about dropping things off the bench, so to speak. So let's go to Iara. If Iara is still with us, is she? Am I?
Yes,
Yeah,
I am
I
here.
can't see you, Iara. I must be on the wrong screen. Are you okay? So why don't you introduce yourself, Iara, and you're going to talk to us a little bit about the way that you have been seeing these topics grow and the role of diplomacy in this. In particular, it goes back, I think, to the points that people have said that we're looking at synergies and multidisciplinary and connections to be able to mobilize finance, and being able to connect across borders and boundaries of institutions, never mind international borders, requires a certain art of diplomacy. So give us your perspective on that, Yara.
Hey, thanks, James. So I'm Yara Giacomini. I'm working as a water director in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of Brazil. I'm in Brazil right now. I'm also oceanographer and a limnologist. And it came by, I got catched by the water diplomacy and its role in so many aspects of the water management. So as we all know, water is the foundation of life and a critical resource that connects us all, but yet it is a source of competition and conflict. So as we are navigating in all this era of climate change, biodiversity laws, and degradation, the water diplomacy has emerged as a tool, a key tool, I can say, for fostering collaboration and resolving disputes. So today I'd like to reflect here with you on how the art of water diplomacy has shaped the discussions around the water in COPs and why it remains pivotal for closing the nature and finance gap and how to advance in sustainable solutions. So James, as you mentioned before, I like to see me and some colleagues that water diplomacy is both a science and an art because it involves identifying, prevent, and resolving conflicts over water use. And we can say that's we say science because the science focuses on the hydrological expertise, understanding the technical intricacies of water systems and their interplay with climate, land, biodiversity, and so on. However, it's the art of diplomacy that often determines success. The ability to connect with the stakeholders, understanding their perspectives, and foster trust in the midst of tension. It's not science that come by here, it is diplomacy. So we say this art goes beyond technical knowledge. It's about listening, truly listening the competing water users, understanding their positions, understanding their justification, and most importantly, their underlying interests. So it's about identifying zones of convergence, however small, but still building from there. So it's also about effectively communicating your own position constructively, which opens the path to shared solutions. So there is a water diplomat that I like very much. Her name is Zach Schubert, and she says, this ability to create space for an agreement, it is at the very heart of the water diplomacy. So I think we should explore more this in the next COPs and opportunities that we have. And this art has been repeatedly displayed in the context of the COP discussions, because water is not a single issue resource, as was mentioned here before. It is inherently multi-objective. So it must need for agriculture, energy, biodiversity, and human consumption, while respecting the boundaries of our ecosystems. And when the negotiation cross regional, national, and international borders, these complexities multiply because we have divergent values, knowledge gaps, unequal power dynamics, and all of these create fertile ground for water disputes. But it is precisely in these moments and places that the diplomacy can shine and bring us for something better. So one of the lessons we have learned from the past COPs is that successful water negotiations hinge on both technical frameworks and human connections. For instance, fostering informal moments of interactions over coffee breaks, shared meals, or even group walks often helps dissolve barriers. These informal spaces create opportunities to build trust, repair historical wounds, and overcome deep-seated skepticism. Because trust is not built in the plenary rooms, it grows in moments of shared humanity. So we go for something we don't talk very, very often. However, technical solutions alone cannot solve water conflicts and dispute. Often the barriers are not about science, but about perception. conflicts arise not just from what is said or done, but from how it is perceived. So historical grievances, unacknowledged mistakes, and unresolved issues of fairness can derail even the most well-intentioned agreements. So this underscores a vital principle in water diplomacy, to never assume you fully understand the perspective of others, but always ask, always validate. Really understanding the perception of all the parties is the cornerstone for successful negotiation. And as we look out towards to 2025 with climate change Ramsar COP, one thing for me is clear, is that we need more water diplomats. We need leaders who can navigate the delicate balance of competing needs, who can mediate across cultures and disciplines, and who can bring humanity into the negotiations over this precious resource. We can say water diplomacy is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And as we focus on closing the nature finance gaps through water, diplomacy serves as a critical bridge. Effective water diplomacy can unlock financial mechanisms, foster cross-sector collaboration, and ensure that investments align with the diverse needs of stakeholders. By resolving conflicts and building trust, diplomacy creates the stable foundation necessary for long-term financial commitments and sustainable solutions. And as we chart path forward from the outcomes of the climate, biodiversity, and land COPs, let us remember that diplomacy is not just about dialogue. It's a tool, a practical tool, to channel resources, align priorities, and turn shared challenges into collective opportunities. And I believe together, James, we can make water a unifying force for both environment and financial progress. That's it. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Yara. Very, very relevant. I was only in an event just before Christmas, Science Policy Interface event, where they said that research itself demonstrates that only 20% of change comes through science and technical frameworks. It's 80% of it is relational, about how you relate to the issues, how you relate to other people and their needs to be able to get change. So very, very relevant. So we've got a question in the chat, which is directed towards you, Noreen, which is about the holistic landscape approach for freshwater ecosystems, is of something that's growing in recognition, dealing with the system and its integrity at that broad scale. But I wonder, the question from Elton is asking, can you share how that would transform the way we address water resilience currently? And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, and if you want to sort of try and see if you can respond to that. You're on mute, Noreen. That's it. Thank you.
So I'll try to answer this as much as I can. So yeah, what I was talking about is definitely land management and integrated land management, like which has come repeatedly, from what other speakers here were also talking about, is that it is a watershed scale approach. It is creating that synergy between adaptation and mitigation. It is looking at, it is about looking at things, holistically and not just in silos or separately. Particularly for freshwater-based mitigation, because some of what there are a lot of knowledge gap. We know particularly very little about mitigation strategies or mitigation approaches, or we don't have that solid science about carbon dynamics in different kind of rivers and floodplains in different parts of the world. But whatever we know, we see that this variation depends on the hydrology, on the climate, on the surrounding landscape in terms of that, what kind of sediments and nutrients are coming in. So technically you can say the water quality, so and that also integrates the water temperature and everything. So these are all also fed by the surrounding landscape. Do you have forested landscape? Do you have agricultural landscape? How is water treated, and how, if it is sent back to the wetland system or the river system and the freshwater systems or not, how well the connection is between the floodplain and the mainstream channel. the connection between the wetlands and the surrounding vegetations and their standing time and all of it. So to utilize the mitigation aspect of wetlands, just restoring the wetlands in terms of, the demarcation or, in other ways, is not, going to fully help unless, this hydrologic aspects, which is depending on so many other things about how much
Sure,
water is coming
sure.
in.
Yeah, no, I get you totally, Noreen. So that's great. All of this, however, requires resources, right? It requires human capital, it requires financial capital, it requires institutional capital. So just one topic that's come up that Bapon suggested, talked about, Tom did, Kate did, and it's linked to the GDP points that Lucy raised at the beginning, is are we just, we're looking for sophistication here to a certain extent, right? You need to be able to mobilize finance in a particular way, and we're looking at the need for countries to be able to access those resources to deliver this type of work on the ground. That requires a certain level of sophistication in the human capacity, but also in the ability to mobilize this type of financial resources. Is that the problem? Are we making it too difficult to mobilize finance? Is that the real challenge we've got here? Is everyone too risk averse, often quite rightly, because of concerns over how the finance is to be used, possibly even into maladaptive solutions as well for climate? So is that one of the real sort of, is that a deal breaker here? Are we just not, we're not opening up more flexible instruments for countries to be able to mobilize finance, or the framework that you mentioned at the beginning, Kate, with CBI, we haven't used it enough, or we haven't been able to take it to the ground enough and demonstrate what it means in practice to countries. So are we missing a trick here?
I mean, I'm happy to go first. I don't think it's as straightforward as, if only it was as straightforward as, just getting more resource. We're competing with so many other agendas, right? And it's what we're asking of everybody is to do things differently, when it's much easier to just continue to do as we've always done, because I don't have to think about it, and I don't have to talk to that person, and I don't have to go and find the keys in the meter room, and I don't have to understand what river basin I'm in. It's just easier to do what we've always done. But sadly, as we know, that business as usual approach is not working. I think on the CBI front, we just didn't fundraise to get the money to do all of the promotion and the marketing associated with making sure that the market knows that this instrument even exists. So I think some of it is just down to really good communications and marketing, in order, certainly when it comes to attracting private finance attention, that we fail to look beyond the life of let's create the standard towards, okay, well, what does it actually take to get this thing used and normalized at scale, I would say, on that particular front.
Anybody else want to have a tackle on that point? I mean, one thing that you mentioned there, Tom, also was the intermediary fund financing, and I wondered if that's an instrument that, how much is that used in terms of being able to mobilize concessional funds into commercial banks? How often is that used, or is that something that could be used far, far more to be able to get funds down to that local level, where it's most needed when it comes to investing in freshwater ecosystems?
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, it's not a typical instrument used in freshwater management or natural resources. It's far more common in kind of energy and some of the harder sectors that to achieve the same ends. But again, those investments are a bit more clear in terms of the data available, the impacts, et cetera, where like NBS, you still are dealing with some uncertainties. But I think it also comes back to the institutional frameworks that you're working with. And well, it's great to talk about source to sea or landscape approach, but you have to deal with both the horizontal and vertical integrations of institutions that are managing this. And that's a real challenge. And unless you have an institution that can play a leadership role, but have this broader view to bring parties together, or you have another platform to come in. I mean, this is an area where IFIs and other international institutions can play a role to be a broker to bring these things together. It's just not going to happen if you have even all this money available, but then, yes, how do you get it on the ground and get behavior change with a smallholder farmer? You know, that's the hard part, I think, really, over.
Yeah, absolutely. Bapon, you want to come in on this point? And then
I
we'll
think
have
the
to
last
wrap
point,
up
I mean,
soon. Go ahead, please.
as we just mentioned about actually whether we have a risk appetite or risk adverse, but I think the challenge here is actually the regulatory framework. Do we have actually an ecosystems where actually you can actually provide those kind of instrument? And then actually where is the concessionality is coming? Because the amount of infrastructure you are talking about, and if you look at the current market price, and with the public sector owning all those, billion-dollar asset, it's not actually sustainable at this moment. So what kind of actually enabling environment you can actually create so that everyone can have a safer environment? But also on a Kate point, I mean, there is also lacking on the vocabulary, because when you're looking at the different kind of bond or other initiatives, it doesn't actually match with our water vocabulary versus the financing vocabulary, and that's why I think they don't find those kind of easy way to convince that yes, we can actually come and play a critical role. So how can actually we create or matching those kind of vocabulary with the climate bond and other bond with this water bond is quite important here actually to look at. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Bapon. So just conscious of the time, and we said that we would only take the hour, so it's sort of a very quick, rapid discussion on these topics. So I won't carry on any further. I think just to sort of summarize, we've covered quite a few issues here, but I think certainly there are these sort of regular points coming up. One is that standards help give direction, and they also help channel action activity, and they give a level of confidence to those wanting to invest in these systems. So I think we have to learn from that and learn from the fact that, as you pointed out, Kate, that there are these things out there that we've all been involved with, but actually we're not making the most of them. I think the other point then you mentioned a few times, Bapon, is about the regulatory framework. So you need to make sure that there is actually the ability to mobilize resources in the right way at the right time for the people who can use it and actually make it happen in the right, in the right sort of way. So that's another element that's probably not sophisticated enough, and I mean that in the sense that they're just probably not updated. Regulations don't get updated that often, so there is an issue there in terms of regulatory updates that match the actual opportunities for mobilizing finance into these natural systems. The capacity building is obviously a constant drumbeat in the background, raising awareness to these issues of the system. And like your point at the beginning, Noreen, it wasn't just about the peatland or the wetland, but it's also about the river plain. It's also about the river basin, that these are natural systems, part of the hydrological cycle, but also part of the carbon cycle, that are constantly drying and re-wetting. They are storing and releasing at any one time. And the more that we disrupt that, the more that we damage the broader hydrological carbon cycles, which I think is a point you were mentioning, Lucy, is that then that doesn't even get picked up in our GCMs and our overall economic models. So we're actually completely discounting the value of these natural systems to our economies in the first place, because we don't include them in our overall climate modeling and the role of water that it plays in that. So there are a few areas where I think the science needs to sort of, and the economics needs to step up. And then on the point of synergies, so a very topical word at the moment, looking at interdisciplinary interconnections, integrations, synergies, etc. And whilst we look at that across policies, I think the key thing also probably has to be in the teams that we work within ourselves. Do we have access to the right understanding and the right skills? Do we have access to the right levels that we need within our own institutions to be able to create these links? And do we work with the right partners who can bring these skills together to create this whole sort of mini ecosystem, the word that you use, Bapon, around these systems, and vocabulary and skill building ourselves, and within the topic of water and ecosystems, to be able to access climate finance in the way that I think we need to. And I think this is very, very relevant. In the projects that I've been involved with, getting the large finance to move around some of these topics is really complicated, because we don't have all of the skills that we need around the table. And that's where you have to reach out and bring in different partners, and they need to see something on the table for themselves to be interested in as well. So it's always a negotiation. So I think it's a really, really great set of points. We're going to try and keep the discussion going on on the LinkedIn profile of WINS. So I'm just going to show one last slide on that front right now. Hopefully you can see that. So to continue that discussion, we'll put some of the questions and some other things on the WINS LinkedIn page. For those of you who are on LinkedIn, please do follow that and take a look at that over the course of the rest of this week, and we'll keep some of the conversation going. Find out more about WINS on their website at Water for Net Zero. Our own IUCN Water Knowledge platform at waterandnature.org. For more information on WINS, please contact Josh Weinberg at the allianceofwater.org. And for any more information around this particular webinar or following up on this webinar as well, please contact Ala Al-Dwari, who works with me here at IUCN. Thank you very much to you all as panelists and for your initial presentations there as well. From Noreen and Lucy, thanks very much. Thanks for the discussion, the points. There's an awful lot more we could talk about, but we wanted to keep it short and sweet because everyone's always very busy. Thanks very much to you as the audience. And please do join on the LinkedIn webpage for WINS so you can stay involved in the conversation. And with that, I will bid you all goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thanks
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.